So let's talk about, saturation and pressures, and when we're troubleshooting or we're doing any kind of refrigeration work, there's always a lot of debate around, okay, well, we should use saturation, or no, well, a lot of guys still use pressure, and you really get into the weeds of the fact of, well, isn't pressure saturation and saturation pressure, like, aren't they kind of all the same? And there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of thoughts revolving around it. I would like to get my thoughts out there and just kind of where I stand on the subject. Ultimately, kind of going back, whenever I first got into the trade, honestly, I didn't even know what saturation was. My very first interactions with it, we didn't even use temperature clamps. We didn't check superheat. We didn't look at subcool. As an apprentice, I was strictly taught literally beer can cold. And if you're not familiar with that, you're actually holding the suction line. And the way that they taught me, at least, was when the suction line feels like a beer can, it's done. You're charged. Everything's good in the system. And what's crazy about that is there's actually a breakover point when you're charging refrigerant. And usually it means you're overcharged, actually, come to find out later. But when you're charging refrigerant, you'll feel the suction line and it will feel slightly warm to cool. And then all of a sudden that line will you'll feel the flood happen, basically. It'll just go to, all of a sudden, it'll feel legit like you're holding a beer can in your hand. You're charged. Your system's good. If you walk up to a system and you don't feel that, something's wrong. A lot of the time, some of the guys that I worked with, yeah, they legitimately wouldn't even use the high side of their gauges hardly ever. It was almost always walk up, throw the low side on, see what the pressure said. Oh, that's good, that's bad, whatever. And then start adding refrigerant if they didn't fill the beer can. So anyway, an evolution of that, there's a lot of people that really start to memorize numbers. And what I mean by numbers is pressures specifically. They start to memorize pressures instead of actually learning the saturations. And there's two lines of thought here. From what I understand, at least in my perspective, and I sit back, look at it, think about it. One line of thought says that, okay, I'm working on a ton of 410A equipment, and I know that roughly I should see between X and Y on my pressures typically. And when I start talking to other technicians, and you really see this in guys who've been around a little bit longer, or maybe who are newer into it and just have less experience, I don't know, you'll see that they talk in pressures a lot. You don't hear a lot of conversation about temperatures. And what I mean by temperatures, I do mean saturation. Now, this doesn't mean that these guys aren't actually taking temperature readings and actually trying to check things, but one of the first things they'll do is, before they start checking their temperatures, like the superheat and subcool, so the pipe temps, before they actually start that process, they will just sit there and they'll see what their pressures are, and then they'll start to kind of get an idea of, okay, well, my suction looks a little low here, my high side's a little low, or maybe I've got a little bit high pressure on the high side, my low side looks a little low on pressure compared to what I'm used to seeing. Maybe that's some kind of indicator that we've got whatever issue going on. High pressure restriction on the liquid line dryers, a common one I hear. There's a handful of reasonings behind those pressures specifically, and then at some point they will start to dive deeper once they feel like they have a kind of an entry-level understanding as to what's happening based off of strictly the pressures. Me personally, after I got into school and I began to actually study refrigeration process principles and all the proper things about it, that's when I learned about using superheat, subcool, and actual saturations, and I learned what those things were. So obviously that's not what I do today, if you've been following me for any length of time. So the second line of thought goes to, we're going to look at temperatures only, essentially. Instead of, when you hook up gauges, instead of your eyes going to what the pressures are doing, instead you hone in more on what the temperatures are doing. And this is one good thing about, say, digital gauges. While digital gauges do give you a saturation temperature, or I mean a pressure, your eyes get attracted to the saturation temperatures more naturally, in my experience, when you're dealing with digital gauges. So it's easier for somebody that's using that to, especially if they're training on that, and that's where they're getting their experience, to kind of think of it in that way. Whereas, alternatively, obviously analog would be would be the other choice. When you think of a system from a saturation perspective, you're looking at strictly what the temperatures are doing, and that's going to directly correlate to your superheat and subcool. But even, let's say you take a similar approach and you walk up and you've put your gauges on, you haven't even started checking temperatures yet, and you're just strictly looking at what are my saturations up front. At the end of the day, you're doing the same basic thing. So, you know, I challenge the thought, what is, in today's refrigeration process and refrigerants and all the different options we have on the table, what does pressure actually mean anymore? My stance on this is pressure is nothing more than just relative to the refrigerant. What I train is that you only need to know pressure to know saturation. Now, obviously, I'm kind of cutting to the chase a little bit here. I lean to the monitor saturation and monitor temperatures first, not necessarily pressures. But I don't think somebody that looks into pressures is necessarily wrong, but I think there's a margin of error that you have to be careful with. Now, in my last podcast, there was a comment that made mention of, you know, people that are strictly looking at pressures, so aka people who use analog gauges over somebody that uses a digital gauge. You know, they were stating that somebody with analog gauges, it gets more honed in on pressure over temperature or anything else, which could be very true if you're dealing with somebody that doesn't properly use a PT chart, or hell, today an app. You know, just use your the Danfoss was it Ref tool, I think it is, where you can convert pressure to temperature. So it's really easy to do that, is my point today. You know, and sometimes maybe guys aren't doing that, because usually an analog gauge will have at most 3 saturations built into the gauge. And most of the time we're working with a lot more than just 3 refrigerants. And that's saying if they have a newer gauge, that it has more newer refrigerants. So the overall premise to that thought was that, so okay, you know, because of the limitations of analog, that the analog people don't pay enough attention to saturation, and trying to troubleshoot things via pressure is a problem. You know, that leads to systems being overcharged. And I think a lot of the guys who are under-trained or just don't understand this industry well enough end up relying so heavily on the pressures that they're used to that they don't even start to recognize what those pressures are relating to in terms of temperature. And that used to be a real thing. Honestly, it's not gone. It's not gone by today's standards in the trade. I think the trade has come a long way in that it's not as hung up on that type of thinking as it used to be. I think a lot more people, because of exposure of social media and otherwise, have gotten a lot more used to using actual saturations and superheats and so forth. Anyway, but he is correct in the fact that, yeah, a lot of systems, it's very easy to walk up to a system that's having, say, an airflow issue, for example, and your first impressions when you see that is it's a low charge, because everything in the system in terms of high side pressures and low side pressures are relative to how much load is being added to the evaporator. At the core fundamentals of refrigeration, the less load you have on the evaporator, the lower the overall system readings are going to be, period. The more load you have, the higher your readings, from the high side to subcooling to superheat to evap saturation, go down the list. Everything is proportional to load. So if you have a evap that has a low input heat, meaning it's got an airflow issue, you end up in a situation where it can look like a low charge. If you don't understand how to read saturations well enough to start to interpret what's happening, your first instinct will go to low charge. And typically somebody like that isn't checking superheat, because, well, one of the first indicators that would contradict that is you would have a low superheat with your low pressures, and that would immediately tell you that it's not a charge issue. Anyway, that's a whole nother. So yes, that technician ends up making the decision that because of both high and low side being low, I'm just going to make a quick charge adjustment. Looks like we're just a little low. I've seen this, 100,000 times. Customer trusts me, I am an experienced guy, that's fine. And then he dumps, 5, 10, whatever, how much refrigerant he gets in there. maybe gets the high side up a little bit, right? The low side barely budges. And then the high side might increase slightly because he's just dumping extra charge in that doesn't need to be there. And then he feels like he accomplished something. And then the callbacks happen, and that leads to somebody else getting called, or a different technician, maybe same company, different tech, goes out, looks at it again, and checks it properly this time, and then finds the overcharge, We got to fix that, then fix the airflow problem. Welcome to the news time. So you asked for it, we voted on it. Everybody almost unanimously agreed that they wanted a news time added, or a news segment to the podcast. So here we go. Here's our very first news segment. AAON has apparently announced that they are committing to a R454B refrigerant. That's going to be their product lineup that they're going to be launching with as their 410A replacement. Per their release, they're going to be saying that, sometime in the third quarter of 2023, a select group of their product line is going to start to see that roll out. And as they do, we'll start to see that more and more in the field. So be looking for that. That's actually a podcast topic that I'm probably going to get into, is some of the refrigerant standards and changes, and the SEER changes, and how just we've got a lot of standards kind of shifting. So I've got it in mind to do some good research on that and try to help bring that as an educated topic to y'all. Item number 2, we had there's a rumor that started a while back about JCI possibly beginning to implement some kind of locks on their software versions, and we've seen some of this kind of stuff over time. Carrier has done something similar with their newer control modules that they're putting in, and heck, on some of these cases they're not even asking the customers for permission to come back and install these modules. A lot of times they just show up and just stick them in, and then we find out after the fact, when nobody's really paying attention. How do I know this, or how do I get to make this claim? Well, this literally happened to us on one of our chiller installs, and where now we have to go through this special thing. They asked not a single person permission. They just showed up when the doors were open one day, put the stuff in. Regardless, York, in their newer micro boards and the firmware for them, they have USB drives, and I've gotten some feedback from guys out there in the field that those newer boards with the firmware, they have started to lock technicians out of it. So the original access codes that we used to be able to use to punch in, and we would have, we'd be able to get to the service settings in the software, that is apparently gone for some of those machines. And so unless you're a JCI employee and able to plug in with a thumb drive, that is no longer an option on some of the newer stuff. I do just warn, being careful. If you have a machine that has maybe an older firmware, be cautious to update that firmware, because you could end up getting locked out of your machine and your ability to log into service mode. As I said, this was a rumor for some time. I've heard this in several different places over time, and now we're starting to get reports that this is a real thing. This is happening. So you have been warned. So number 3, giving Navic a shout out for winning the Innovation Award at the AHR Expo. So their battery powered flaring tool, which has been a massive help for a lot of people out there. I see stuff all the time on just social media in general where people love this tool. I think it's a great reward for them to get. I just want to recognize that they've got a pretty good thing there. It's not something that I necessarily use myself. Really good folks out there have benefited from this thing, so just giving them a shout out for that. Number 4, DeWalt is rolling out a Impact Connect system, and so what this is it's a attachment setup that's going to hook to your DeWalt impact drills. So from what I saw, their first 2 main items that they're releasing with this, there's going to be a automated pipe cutter that it attaches to it, and it will cut it much like I think this is kind of a response to some of Milwaukee's tools they've had for a while, where they had the battery powered pipe cutter, and then the other one is a flaring tool. Now DeWalt historically has had like a PEX flaring. Now we don't necessarily use PEX on our end of the industry, but it is part of that tool package. And I know that DeWalt is looking to expand this as time moves forward. These are just kind of their probably 2 most popular products that they expect to sell and kind of get the system launched and started. This is something we see a lot of the tool manufacturers switching to, are modular drills and head setups and various things. So this is pretty exciting in my opinion to see this type of product come out and just be less we have to carry on a regular basis and more tools into one. I'm all about having a multi-tool type setup where things are condensed and consolidated into a more unified product. So I'm doing a lot of talking to get around the fact that there's these 2 main mindsets, and the reason I prescribe to looking at everything through a lens of saturation is ultimately the pressure, other than to be relevant to the refrigerant, means essentially nothing at the end of the day. And I train that way because, in my opinion, you should have a much greater grasp of the temperatures and what those mean from saturation to superheat, and forget about the pressures. Because here's what I've seen happen is when young guys especially, they start dealing with refrigerants they're not familiar with. So I saw this very heavily with 410A in the early days. Heck, I struggled with this with 410A until I began to understand refrigeration better. And then as things like 407C, for example, have become more prevalent in the industry, I still see this today with some guys that they get spooked by the refrigerant because they put too much stock into, well, I know, okay, if I'm working on a 410A system, then I know my pressure should be between X and Y. That's almost always how that conversation starts. And I immediately stop the conversation, go, okay, at the end of the day, I don't care what your pressure is. What is your saturation? And what that leads to is, if you can stop worrying about the actual pressure and understanding that, okay, well, 40 to 45 degrees of saturation is between, X and Y pressure of any refrigerant. Instead of worrying about that specific refrigerant's pressure, if you instead focus in on that refrigerant's temperature, then it doesn't matter what the refrigerant is. Refrigeration principles apply across the board. Now, you have to be careful with blends. You have glide. So glide is when the boiling points between condensing and evaporation are different depending on how the blends of the refrigerant are. I've done entire classes on glide before, so you can go check those out if you wish. But at the end of the day, as long as you use glide properly, the principle of refrigeration is the same regardless. It's not any different. And that's where I think that understanding saturations and understanding temperature over trying to memorize pressures per each type of refrigerant is going to take you a lot further and maybe even help make refrigeration troubleshooting easier. I've seen several times where guys just get hung up on the pressures thing. They get very nervous because they're seeing a refrigerant that they're not familiar with how the pressures interact and why the pressures are the way they are, when ultimately it doesn't matter what the pressures are. I would like to hear a lot of thought on this. I would like to engage in a conversation, and for you that yeah, maybe you do the pressure side of it and that's where you put a lot of focus and weight and stock, I'd like to hear your feedback and thoughts. Hearing me make my case about stop using pressure, focus on saturation, other than it being a change of mindset for you, why do you feel it is more efficient to still pay attention to pressures instead of just talking in saturation? Now, for a lot of guys, I can absolutely recognize that at the end of the day, what are we actually arguing? Like, maybe it's not even arguing. What are we discussing? Aren't we discussing literally the same things? We're talking saturation to pressure, but isn't saturation pressure and pressure saturation? Yes. It's exactly what we're discussing. Saturation is pressure, pressure is saturation. One of the things that has stood out to me is, as an industry, I don't think we have a deep enough understanding of the relationships between the different theories in this industry. And what I mean by that is, take psychrometrics and refrigeration principles. How many guys would equate the two side by side and the fact that they're one and the same in a lot of ways. And I'll take that a step further. How many guys understand that refrigeration principles are built on top of psychrometrics? I'll take that a step further. How many guys understand that psychrometrics is the foundation that our entire industry is built on? You don't have air conditioning without psychrometrics. But yet, psychrometrics is probably one of the least understood principles in our entire industry. You know, I see a problem with that. I see that as a major negative draw to what it is we're trying to do. That's one of the things that I hope that this channel and this brand and everything about it, you know, this podcast will help some of you begin to rethink how you think about specific things in this industry. And the psychrometric side of it is why I really push the importance of, you know, really learning the temperatures and not getting hung up on the pressures or the rules of thumb or any of the other things that we have such a tendency to do, because those temperatures live inside of that psychrometric chart. And heat, you know, there's two types of heat, and there's so much to what feeds into that. If we're not careful with how we think about refrigeration theory, we will always struggle with understanding the troubleshooting that we're doing. And we'll always wonder why, you know, we sometimes have a hard time giving the customer a proper answer as this is your problem and this is all it is, and this is what you need to do to fix it. It's not always going to be that straightforward. And I think a lot of you have that problem because of the foundation laid. I've been through trade school. I know how they're taught to teach it, and I've read all those same books myself. And I don't think it's a trade school problem. I don't think the trade schools are wrong in how they're teaching, but I think there's a higher level of understanding and thinking about this than most technicians take the time to read deep enough into. But at the same time, how many of you actually understand that there is a higher level to begin with? And that's, if you take anything from this, understand that what you learned in school was basically step one of refrigeration principles and theory. And one of the things that didn't really happen, at least that they don't in my experience, what I've seen in all the trade schools I've worked with, they don't really marry psychrometrics and refrigeration very much. And that's something that if you really want to become the highest end technician that you want to be, you need to develop that. A lot of guys have probably developed that over the years naturally, and they just didn't realize the correlation. Nobody put labels to what that correlation was. And I'm here trying to create maybe a label that doesn't exist. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe at minimum trying to bring awareness to something very specific and important. A big question that I do get from several people is, how have I advanced the way that I have in the industry for as young as I am? And honestly, this is one major way. It was, I started with my foundations, and you'll be surprised at how much more clarity you have as to how things in this industry work and function when you have an extremely solid foundation. Because so many trivial things just mean they're so much easier to understand, and that's how they become trivial. They truly become that trivial because your foundation is solid enough to where the basic principle of what it is just that simple to you at the end of the day. Check out TrueTech Tools if you guys haven't. It's HVAC time. It's the promo code. That'll get you 8% off. I really appreciate all the guys that go out there and do that. That does help support the channel, and it gives me the resources I need to just kind of keep this thing going. And it's not a small task keeping something like this moving forward and functioning, and just whatever. It's a lot. It is a lot. If anybody is ever interested, or if you're in a weird spot where you need some support or anything of that nature, go to my website, hvactimetx.com. I do offer, a tech support service. I offer consultations. I also offer personalized trainings. If you ever need any of that kind of stuff, please go on there, check it out. Let me know if whatever help you need. I'll try my best to get to you and give you a hand. A lot of it does get done either like over my lunch breaks or just after hours as I get home in the evenings and so forth, or a phone call conversation on the drive home for whatever situation you got going on. So just know that resource is there to you if you ever need it. with that, I appreciate y'all. Hope you enjoyed the podcast, and MTT guys, we'll see you around.